we are about to start our second and final talk of the night tonight, Liz Hyde. Liz Hyde is an aerospace engineer who cut her teeth designing, building, and flying science experiments at NASA and the US Geological Survey. Her projects have ranged from strapping cryocooled infrared astronomy instruments to the back of a 747 to installing small radio beacons to track sea otters in Monterey Bay, to dreaming up commercial economies at the moon, to traipsing through the forest to measure the effects of wildfires on landscape using drones, of course. Some of these experiments involved moving fluid around in microgravity, and what better way to test the experiments than parabolic flight campaigns on the zero-G aircraft? Liz currently works at a space startup in Albuquerque and has just celebrated her first new Mexi-versery. Everyone give a round of applause to Liz Hyde. One second, sorry. And loading. Here you go.
All right.
Sweet. Down is next.
Perfect. All right, how's it going? My name is Liz Hyde. We're going to talk about beer in space. I'm going to stall a little bit so you can see the beauty of that title slide. All right. Here's a little backstory in the I Love Me slide. As we said, aerospace engineer, went to San Jose State, and did most of my career at NASA Ames up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Did a whole bunch of stuff. I said airplanes, space missions, but kind of in the middle, I had my microfluidics era. So worked on a bunch of biology payloads that went into space, testing various things. And as you see in the top picture, my prerequisite Tinder photo on every presentation. In a zero-G flight, that was for this wet lab program that's in the middle. But the question of why you become interested in it kind of goes back to this. During that flight, you can't really tell in the picture, but there's a group behind us also doing some experiments. A bunch of Australians. And while we were talking to them, figured out they were there doing some actual science, but they're like, yeah, so our real job is we have a brewery in Australia, and we're trying to make space beer. Which felt very on the nose. So remember that story because it'll come back later. And so asking them about it, and they were talking about zero-G stuff. And my project that you can kind of see in the middle there, that's a picture of it on the ISS. We're doing RNA extraction. So what you would have with pipettes in a lab, that doesn't really work in space, and we'll talk about why. So you got to make things like that in the middle. And that bottom picture is a fluidics card. You can see some bubbles in there. We'll talk about bubbles. But yeah, similar thing. So that's kind of where I leaned into this. And then since then I was on some other stuff, other space things and airplane things and drone things, and that's fun, but not related to this talk. All right. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to talk about fluid mechanics of beer as an example as I stand in front of the speaker. Then we're going to talk about how that goes in microgravity, what makes that different. And then we'll talk about what kind of tech and what people are looking at in this realm, which will start to make sense as we kind of go through this. So let's start with some vocabulary. Some of these words I'm sure all of you know, and some of them are probably weird. Density, I think we all know what that is. Viscosity, we all probably know what that is. It's kind of the thickness, right? Surface tension, you can see that dot or the drop on a leaf. That's the surface tension holding that bubble together. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Convention, I think everybody knows this if you've ever made pasta or boiled water. But basically how that flow circulates because of higher density, lower density going up and down. Surfactants, we all know this as soap, but it's also foam, like the foam in your beer glass. And nucleation, that's a weird word, but that's basically spots that bubbles can form. So you see that top picture, somebody sticking their finger in some seltzer water. All those little spots are nucleation spots. There's more, that's just the gist. So the thing that makes beer, it's not just beer, but it's any carbonated beverage that's going to be problematic, as we'll see. But there's 3 different ways we can have carbonation. We can have natural, geology is a fun one. So that's the soda dam up in Jemez, but there's other soda dams all over the place where carbon dioxide that's in rocks is next to the water, the carbon dioxide dissolves, and now you have fizzy water in that lake or river, whatever it is. That's the geology way. There's also the biology way, which is the beer way. So we have a biologic process that off-gasses carbon dioxide. Talk about that a little bit more. Then there's the artificial way. So there's kind of two examples here. It's a typical soda fountain. We're forcing carbon dioxide into our fluid. And then those bottles on the side. It's a very old school way of doing it, but it's really fancy in Japan. To kind of keep your carbonation in there, you have some vessels in there that prevent it from going flat. But moving on. So how is beer made? Let's talk about this very quickly. I have not delved into microbrewing as a side hobby yet in my life, so don't come at me if this is wrong. But basically, we take wheat or barley, turn it into sugar. That sugar then gets eaten by yeast cells, or we'll go through the chemical process in a second, which will create alcohol. It also creates carbon dioxide, and then you can also add carbon dioxide after. It's what makes the bubbles go up and down. Oh no, chemistry. So to break this equation down, this is what's happening in yeast fermentation. So sucrose is your sugar that you're ingesting. The ethanol is the fun stuff. It's going to be ETOH in the rest of the slides because it's less words. And we got carbon dioxide. The rest of that is organic chemistry insanity. But just take it to be that's what the yeast wants, because the yeast ultimately wants that ATP at the end. And all this other stuff is waste products that we very much enjoy. But the important part is that carbon dioxide at the end. So in a normal fermentation process, we are off-gassing carbon dioxide. When you have a closed container, that carbon dioxide can go back into the liquid. Some other fermentation, you would just let it off-gas, and then it's not fizzy. So what's in a bottle of beer? We got pressurized air at the top. We got that water, which is 80%-ish. We got dissolved carbon dioxide. We got alcohol. We also have starchy bits, hoppy bits, and minerals. And what happens when we open it is when the air kind of starts mixing with the system and we start getting some off-gassing, get some mixing around. But all of those starchy bits, those hoppy bits, and the minerals in the water are what are causing the bubbles to go up in your beer as you drink it, because that is what the bubbles are attaching to. When you pour it into a glass, it gets even worse. Another math scary thing, but that's okay because we don't really care. The important thing here is you can kind of see what's going on down here. We got convection going on. That's the bubbles kind of mixing, coming up and down. What that equation is talking about is how the bubbles grow over time. So basically that stream of bubbles that are coming up out of the bottom of your beer. And the important thing you need to know is that green box with a G, because that is gravity. So what happens when the gravity goes away? This is a picture of boiling water on the space station. Well, space station on the right, Earth on the left. Think about it. When there is no gravity, there is no buoyancy force. The bubbles cannot move up your glass because there is no up in space. So what kind of happens? We don't have this buoyancy force. There's no this density differential doesn't mean anything because we're not working against gravity. You can kind of see in the picture, surface tension becomes our dominant force. So what those bubbles want to do is stick together because that's the biggest force in that whole system. So you can kind of see, it's kind of hard to see on the right, but that is one big bubble just forming onto itself, whereas the rest are kind of just going up, right, as they heat up. So it likes to hang to itself or to the walls, other things that are going to be path of least resistance, right? That's cool. So here's some fun pictures. We're just going to leave it on this slide for a bit because it's fun. You see the upper left, we got an astronaut squirting some honey out. That's a viscous fluid, so it doesn't really move a whole lot, as opposed to kind of the water you see down below. On the upper right, we got Chris Hadfield playing with a washcloth, so that's kind of how you shower in space, right? Water doesn't go anywhere. It's just sticking to his hands, and it's sticking to the towel, right? It's not even floating around, but it's really just wanting to stay within itself. So that's kind of awkward washing like that, as you can imagine. The bottom picture is the one I can look at for days. It's very zen. That's actually part of an experiment looking at slosh in tanks, which is a big problem. Because it's really hard to quantify because the physics are really weird. But you can see as he spins it around, as it's spinning, there is that centrifugal force pushing that fluid to the ends of that tank. And then when he stops it, that momentum keeps him going. But all of that fluid is traveling around the walls of that vessel, right? So again, we're not really creating bubbles in that situation. We kind of have a big bubble in the middle. That's all the air in that tank, right? All right, what happens when you drink a beer? What happens when you drink a lot of beer really fast, or seltzer? Yeah, how does a burp work? Yeah, you're starting to realize it now, huh? So, on the Earth, when you need a burp, you have gas in your... I did not make slides for this because it's kind of gross and I feel like it. But the bottom picture, I think, does the picture. You have carbon dioxide now in your gut. You have air that you're like, oh, dude, I need a burp. It all comes up, right? Because you have a diaphragm and that air is sorted. That doesn't happen in space. So what actually happens is you can burp in space. It's very unpleasant. The astronauts have complained about it a lot, which we'll get to. But basically, your burp is also a wet burp. There's other stuff with it. Because you can't just evacuate the air. You're loving this talk, Chris? Are you glad you came? So what do we think about beer in space? Is that a good idea? Are we thinking? Is that going to be a comfortable idea? Yeah. Well, on the subject of drunk astronauts, next slide. So, beer in space is probably not a great idea, but there has been work in this field, especially now. There's been a couple phases. The first one I'll talk about in kind of space lore in history, where the private space industry has been a thing. It's really big now. Also in the 80s, basically in the era in between Apollo and the Challenger incident, NASA specifically was under a lot of budget constraint. They also had the space shuttle, which increased access to space by a lot, and they needed stuff to do. So there was a lot of private companies involved with kind of doing their own stuff. Once Challenger happened, a lot of that went by the wayside because it was not kind of a free-for-all. But one of these experiments was the Cola Wars, aka the Pepsi Challenge for people younger than whatever era that was. So you can kind of see this picture. Coke and Pepsi submitted items. Actually, that Coke can is in the Smithsonian. You can see the guy in the middle who's taking a hit of that Pepsi that looks like a shaving cream can. It is a shaving cream can. Pepsi spent $14 million to put Pepsi in a shaving cream can to beat Coke, who beat them to the punch and only spent $250K. Just gonna say. Yeah. The verdict was, this is terrible. Another thing about space, the lack of convection. Your sense of smell goes away. You don't have a lot of those volatiles getting in your nose. So like flavor reported by astronauts is very weak. So they like a lot of hot sauce, a lot of stuff that they can taste that's not dependent on aromatics. They basically said it tastes like Coke that forgot that it was Coke. And then also, this is making us all really gassy and uncomfortable. So that didn't last. Coke has done some other experiments. I didn't include them on here. They've done some more soda fountain-y things. A lot of them are syrup-based. We'll get a little bit to that in a second. So the carbonation side, maybe not the best. At least for a zero-G environment. We'll get to the moon and Mars in a second. So the Russians. Back to alcohol. NASA is very puritanical in there's no alcohol in space. Fun fact, though, the first known alcoholic beverage in space was Neil Armstrong doing communion on the moon. But it was communion, so it doesn't count. All right. That's not what I wanted. Go back to this. So this picture was very controversial. So this is 1997 on Mir. This is a mixed American and Russian crew. This was a photo taken by a NASA astronaut after they had a pretty scary incident, and this is them chilling out afterward. And this photo was covered up by NASA and only came about after a FOIA request by NBC News. And NASA very much stresses that the guy that took the picture did not partake in the celebratory cognac. So there has been alcohol on the moon, fizzy water, and maybe not so much. But some other research areas that are kind of interesting are beverage containers. So on the far right, we have Scott Kelly, and that is coffee that he has in a bag and a straw. That is pretty much the normal way things go. But we have some things that are, in development. So on the far right is a prototype of a coffee cup. That is a picture taken on the space station by Don Pennant. It's kind of hard to see, especially if you don't know what Kapton tape is. But this is a sheet of plastic with some tape stuck together that he put coffee in because he was tired of drinking it out of a straw. So the coffee sticks to the outside of that thing, and you just basically suck on the edge of it and you pull it in. What that turned into is this very awkwardly shaped cup next to it, which Don Pennant also invented. He's an NASA astronaut. That is the first invention in space that was invented in space while he was on the ISS. And versions of that have flown, like production versions. That particular glass one is a exhibit at RIT, but again, unique properties of zero gravity fluid mechanics, you got to have the edges. So when talking about the edges, we have this martini glass in the middle. This is kind of a concept thing from a private company that they were doing, but if you look at all the ridges inside, it's that same principle where we just have a lot of solid parts for that fluid to live, and it's kind of a maze that it travels through to get to your mouth and ultimately enjoy. Another area is what can you do with zero gravity to make things, whether that's beer, whether that's liquor, or whatever. So having that property where the fluid likes to stick to the walls might be advantageous. That's what a lot of folks are looking at. These are some kind of more recent examples of this. Ardbeg Distillery is one I've known about. They did a 3-year-long aging experiment on the ISS. It apparently did not go well at all. That could just be them. I don't know. We have another Japanese experiment. There's also been some yeast in space, so yeast strains that have been grown in space. A lot of that has gone on, especially with the pharmaceutical industry. Some of the experiments I was talking about in my career involve yeast, just because it's a model organism. People use it a lot. So there's been something there of like, hey, our yeast was grown in space, and now we're making beer out of it. There's been some stuff there. That Four Pines beer is back to my Australian friends. So that is a brewery in Australia. They're kind of working on a low carbonation stout. They're still going for like we can have the beer in space. We just got to really reduce the bubbles and somehow get that mouthfeel. So they've been working on that. Really hard to see. They have a special like pressurized bottle down lower right that they were working on as kind of a prototype. And then Budweiser has done some barley malting processes, kind of also looking at that commercial environment. What could you make in space? And then Starbase Brewing actually so they're in Texas. They just launched on Crew 11, which was in August, a couple of experiments. One of them is looking at soil. They're really looking at the Mars case, which is interesting in a second. Then they're also looking at doing actual fermentation in an experiment. Got some conclusions. The first one, talking about the Mars case. So Mars and the moon have less gravity, but they still have gravity. So it is still a possibility on there. But in zero gravity, probably not a great idea. But it is an interesting thing for distilling brewing. Can you just force that liquid into your oak barrels or something like that? But the verdict's still out. There hasn't really been any commercial success. There's just been a couple of experiments here and there. But the main thing that gets me interested is that fluid mechanics are fun, and I can stare at that video of the pill going around all day. if I really, really need to. So that's all I got. I do have some links because Works Cited is a thing, and there's a link tree with these slides if you want to go look at it later. But yeah, if anybody wants to hit up or talk about microgravity fluid mechanics, I'm all ears.
Does being in space affect like the rate at which people get drunk in space?
It's a very good question, and I think that is also one of those, well, if we don't have alcohol in space, we can't test that. But that concept has been shown true in other regards. The main one is medicine. So one of those projects I had on there was called ECAMSAT. It was looking at antibiotics and how proper dosing. So I'll let your imagination figure this one out, but another common ailment for astronauts is UTIs. Yep, think about it. Antibiotics solve that, but the dosages, they're still trying to figure out what that proper thing is, because again, the absorption of anything into medicine is going to be weird when your blood vessels are sticking to the side, right? What? It's wacky. So this fluid mechanics problem is in a lot of things. But yeah, there's like some hypotheses, but I haven't seen actual studies, and I think it's just because of limited test subjects. We'll see how that goes in the future, though.
So I'm still trying to get my head around gravity and burping. So if you were not in space, but you hung upside down and you tried to burp, would it be difficult and or wet?
Yeah, that's also how you get acid reflux. Yeah, now you got it. What's up?
NASA is barely knowing what it is in general, but how would nitro be any different?
It's just different in that molecule's a different size. So that equation I had on there works for that too. It's just those constants are going to be different numbers. So the bubbles are smaller, the rates will be different, but gist is the same.
The example of the boiling water and low gravity, where the bubbles are just sleeping over each other, effectively making a large bubble. What's the ultimate destination of that process? The bubble collapse on itself, or is it like a filling the bulk tank and then where's the liquid?
Yeah, so you'll have pressurized things at that point. So you also have that gas will be under pressure, and it could redissolve back into the gas. But what will cause the bubble to break is basically anything that breaks the surface tension of that bubble. So it'll attract to that's where the nucleation sites come in. So like you could physically pop it, it'll then stick to whatever you just popped it with, or the walls, but it'll stick to the walls. But you'll run into the same pressure thing that you would otherwise. It's just going to be manifesting in a different way. Same amount of gas. It's just what is that gas in a bunch of little bubbles or one big one?
Well, so during the stout, how are they doing the witching?
The what?
So like when you drink the stout, it's the nitrogen, typically it's
Yeah. I don't know, but I have a feel. Oh, I don't have it on. I think that's part of their canister, is that they have a gas stage in it that it like goes and you have to shake it or something like that. I don't know for sure, but something like that.
actually on their like, so you just trying to burn it. Would not the CO2 stick around?
Well, I don't know that they don't know that it doesn't work. At least the fermentation aspect. I think that's what Starbase is actually doing, is they're just going to do a fermentation process. There's been a couple, as I said, there's been other yeast studies. There's been a lot of them, actually. That hasn't been a problem, but I don't think they've specifically looked at that fermentation issue in that context. Mostly just trying to get, hey, is the yeast alive or dead? Is it eating or not? Which is, if you looked at that, if you saw, if I go back, that is what that box on the lower right is basically. The cells are different colors because there's a dye, and if they're dead, they turn pink, and if they're alive, they're blue. So that's how you would measure that. Yeah, and it's actually, that color is getting the respiration from the yeast. So. Going once, going twice. Oh, one more.
Going back to the boiling water thing, like, you get like vapor and steam, or is that not?
That is your steam.
That is a big problem. So that's weird.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liz Hyde. Super fascinating. I had no idea.